Hello everyone, welcome back to another video on my channel. I'm really sorry that I haven't been uploading for a long time. I've just been on holiday for months and I had my exams and I just didn't really have the time or the willpower to upload. But I'm back now and I'm with a slightly new genre. Because as you know, I usually do like funny reaction videos or YTPs or compilations, etc. But this one, I decided to take a bit of a different approach as I've wanted to do a video like this for quite some time now. I'm a fan of this channel on YouTube called History Buffs, where they find movies and basically review the historical accuracy of the movie and point out its flaws and where it went wrong. And it really inspired me to do a video on Braveheart, as it's a really classic film and one of my favourite eras through history. But before I get started into the video, I just want to say a massive disclaimer that History Buffs did an excellent video on this, which I would thoroughly recommend checking out, and I'll leave a link in the description of the video for you guys to check it out, because it's a really insightful video and it really gets his points across so much better than I probably will in this video. So yeah, it's up to you guys. If you want to watch it, just go down in the description and it'll be right there. But anyways, I'm getting off topic. So the movie Braveheart is made in 1995 by Mel Gibson and Randall Wallace, and it actually won 5 Oscar awards, so it's really good film, and I would definitely recommend watching it before this video if you haven't already. It's the tale of William Wallace, whose country is on the brink of war with the tyrannical English. But William has no desire to take up arms, and he just wants to raise a family and be with the ones he loves. But when a cruel English noble barbarically slaughters his wife, he's forced to fight these invaders out of his country, and in doing so, wins the freedom of his people. So the movie itself is actually really fantastic, I thought, and it's emotional, but also action-packed at the same time, which is quite rare these days. And I'm all for movies enhancing some truths and sometimes twisting others. If it makes a good story, that's perfectly fine. Companies do that all the time, and there's a reason, because it sells tickets to cinemas. People like to watch that stuff, and so do I. But when you outright go out of your way to paint a country as these despicable, tyrannical monsters, and get almost everything wrong, seemingly intentionally, then that's where I would draw the line. Even in the very beginning, the narrator goes out of his way to paint England as these vile brutes who hanged Scottish heroes. And that basically sets the mood and the atmosphere for the rest of the movie. But anyways, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's begin this movie and see just how far into the film we have to go to find just one historical inaccuracy. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Braveheart. So the movie begins in the year 1280 after the death of King Alexander III, who reigned from the 6th of July 1249 to the 19th of March 1286. Only, wait, that can't add up. The movie begins in 1280 after his death in 1286. Are you kidding me?
Historians from England will say I am a liar.
Mate, you're not helping yourself here. You just got the very first date wrong, over half a decade wrong. We're literally not even 12 seconds into the movie and we've already run into an error. And if they get the very first date wrong, how wrong do you think they get William Wallace? Let's find out later. So as I was saying earlier, King Alexander III had just died, and the movie gets the next line right, saying that he had no son and therefore there was no heir to the throne. However, he did have a granddaughter named Margaret of Norway, but she died in 1290, and as she was the last living heir, the Scottish nobles almost had a civil war to decide who will be the next king, as there were 14 claimants, and neither of them could agree on who should be the next king. The two most popular candidates were Robert the Bruce and John Balliol, but the nobles couldn't decide, so they took it to the King of England to mediate, who at that time was King Edward I, who also had many nicknames, such as in this movie, Edward the Longshanks, because he had very long and skinny legs. There was also names such as Edward the Just and Edward the Lawgiver, as he revoked many of the cruel laws made before him, but also created many just ones which we still have today. And fun fact, he also invented change. Well, at least for England he did. But anyways, as I was saying, the two most popular claimants were John Balliol and Robert the Bruce, and Edward I chose John Balliol, but only as long as he swore fealty to Edward as Lord Paramount, and therefore he would be a puppet king of Scotland. John's reign was not a happy one. The Scots got fed up very quickly, as Edward taxed them heavily and made them help fund and fight his wars with France. So the Scots eventually pressurised King John Balliol to launch a preemptive strike on the 12th of March in 1296 on Carlisle Castle, which failed. And in response, King Edward invaded Scotland and made an example out of the people of Berwick-upon-Tweed, as he had the town sacked and slaughtered around 8,000 people, nearly the entire town's population. His army pushed further into Scotland, taking Dunbar, Edinburgh, and finally Stirling Castle, and he then went on to humiliate Scotland by forcing the submission of 1,900 nobles, and in 1291 they were forced to sign the Ragman Rolls, which further embarrassed them. And with the Scots beat, King Edward marched back to England and took with him the Stone of Destiny, which is what the Scottish king sat on when they were coronated. And it's said to be the stone which Jacob rested on in the desert, of where he dreamt of the angels ascending and descending on stairs up to heaven in the Bible. The Scots treasured this stone greatly, and it was prophesied that wherever it was, there the kings of Scotland would be crowned.
Unless the fates of faithless found, and the prophet's voice be vain, where'er this monument be found, the Scottish race shall reign.
Which did not happen until 1603, with King James VI becoming King James I of England. And the stone actually remained in England until we gave it back in 1996. But anyways, King John was captured and stripped of his titles and was imprisoned in the Tower of London, and King Edward then installed viceroys to rule over Scotland in the name of England. And just over a year later, our story begins with William Wallace's rebellion in 1297. Which is strange, considering the movie would have you believe that Scotland had been under England's rule for centuries.
We can win. If we win, well, then we'll have what none of us have ever had before. A country of our own.
And march straight back to England, stopping at every home you pass by to beg forgiveness for 100 years of theft, rape and murder.
It was just 1 year, William. What are you talking about? So now we get our first glimpse of William Wallace, this time as a young child. And this is what the movie has to say about his family.
It was Malcolm Wallace, a commoner with his own lands. He had 2 sons, John and William.
Practically everything said in this sentence is completely wrong. To start off, William Wallace's father was called Alan Wallace, not Malcolm Wallace. He was not a commoner, he was actually far from it. He was a very respected nobleman and lord. And he did not have 2 sons, he had 3 sons, one of which was called Malcolm, and of course there was John and William. It's not that important to the storyline, but it still shows that the movie can't even get simple facts like these right, let alone the big facts that come in later on. So later on we see Alan Wallace and John Wallace stumble upon the massive slaughter of the Scottish nobles, which, as you may have guessed by now, didn't actually happen. So of course that motivates them to go to war with England, but when that fails, William's father and brother are absolutely butchered, which would of course been terribly scarring for a child, if only it happened. Yes, it's true that his father did die when William was young, but it wasn't because he was going to war with England. And John Wallace, William's brother, died the year after William died, in 1306, and he also died in the same way and fashion that William died in, which was completely barbaric. But with them gone, it now introduces us to William's scary and menacing Uncle Argyle, which, of course, you may be sensing a repeating fashion here, he didn't exist. Although William may have had a few uncles help educate him as he was growing up, but this uncle specifically, no evidence for him. But this one's quite important, as it shows later that he taught William Latin and he went on a pilgrimage to the Holy Lands and everything.
My uncle took me on a pilgrimage.
What was it like?
Rien qui approchait d'Abondé.
But William never left Scotland once, except for when he went to France to plead for French aid for his rebellion, which of course proved fruitless, as we know in hindsight. So this movie thinks they can just make up characters as they go along, which is completely fine if it wasn't supposed to be a historical film based on real characters. And later you'll see just how far Mel Gibson and Randall Wallace go to invent new characters to help you sympathise and feel bad for the protagonist, William Wallace. But anyways, let's continue. So this is one of the characters in the film that they get pretty accurate, I think, as King Edward was a very, very vicious, stern man, but England needed stern leadership back then to keep the order and to keep the peace. But if you actually read into other stories which weren't William Wallace's rebellion, you'll see that he was actually one of England's greatest kings throughout their entire history. But of course, this movie will have you believe he's a cruel tyrant. Also, this movie calls Edward the Longshanks a cruel pagan, when in reality, King Edward fought in the Crusades. He was extremely Christian. But of course, this movie wishes to stain England any chance they can. Also, I don't mean to be petty or pedantic, but there's this little bit in the film which still bugs me. So he's saying this in the funeral of Alan Wallace and John Wallace.
Playing outlawed tunes on outlawed pipes.
And I know it's not meant to be taken seriously, it's just supposed to be a cool line which emphasises the sad mood of this scene specifically. But I just want to say, bagpipes were not outlawed. And you can hate me for being petty, I'm just saying they weren't illegal. I found it quite funny that when I was researching the cast of this film, I discovered that the characters such as Hamish, King Edward, Prince Edward, Noble Craig, William's dad, William himself, etc, etc, are all Irish, which is quite interesting considering this movie is all about anti-English resentment, and most of the key characters are all Irish. I wonder, what was the correlation? Also, before I get loads of comments saying how Mel is actually Australian, he's half Australian, and he's also half Irish due to his mother. Now we should fast forward to the bit when Prince Edward II, i.e. the gay prince, is being married to Princess Isabella of France. Now for once this movie gets someone in the film which actually existed, except everything about her in this movie is so wrong to how she was in real life. They paint her out as this compassionate, empathetic, loving wife who was soft and tender and caring to the people of her country. But it couldn't be further from the truth. She was actually called Queen Isabella the She-Wolf of France because she was so ruthless and possibly even more than King Edward I. She was so cruel and harsh that she even had her husband, King Edward II, murdered in a dungeon as she wanted to wage war in Scotland herself with her son, Prince Edward. England hadn't seen a queen this ferocious since probably the days of Boudica, yet the movie goes out of its way to paint her in the most antonymic light possible. Also, I just want to quickly point out that Queen Isabella was 9 years old and was still living in France when William Wallace was dead. Now enough of Princess Isabella, let's move on to Prince Edward II. Now as they're getting married, we see him eyeing up his best friend Philippe, and later of course we see Philippe's death by Edward I. Now this character actually did exist, however not under the name Philippe, but it was under the name Piers Gaveston. He was tall and handsome, but he was very, very wicked, and he led the prince into all kind of mischief until at last King Edward I put his son in prison for a time and banished Piers from the kingdom. No one knows for certain if Piers and King Edward II were secret lovers or not. However, it was common knowledge that they were extremely close friends, and Piers definitely held a sway in court. But of course this movie would like to portray the Prince of Wales as a weakling and a soft, tender boy, but that was not the case at all. Also, I just want to quickly point out before moving on that Prince Edward II and Queen Isabella of France didn't actually marry until 3 years after William's death in 1308. So straight after the wedding scene, we get into the council chamber of King Edward and his council members, and they're discussing possible methods of how to gain control of Scotland. And there's that memorable scene when King Edward grants them Prima nocta. And as this noble perfectly describes what Prima nocta is,
"As lord of these lands, I will bless this marriage by taking the bride into my bed on the first night of her union."
You can probably guess that this, of course, never happened. And the movie makes up a complete mythological tradition to once again paint England as these disgusting brutes, when in fact there is absolutely no historical evidence of Prima nocta ever once existing, let alone being enforced. I mean, it's one thing to paint England as these horrible people, but then there's another to paint them as just complete rapists. But anyways, let's move on. So now we meet one of the key players in this story, and in history, who the movie surprisingly got very, very accurate. Robert the Bruce, or as this movie likes to call him.
Among these was Robert, the 17th Earl of Bruce.
It is time to survive. You're the 17th Robert Bruce.
Even though he was actually the 8th Earl of Bruce, but we don't have to talk about that. And the movie portrays Robert as a very, very confused young noble who doesn't know where his loyalties lie, which was actually very, very true, as Robert did change sides many times during the War for Independence. But of course we know in hindsight that he eventually decided to stay loyal to Scotland and won their freedom. Later we see Robert and his father discussing what to do about this little rebellion, and we get this little dialogue from him.
And understand this. Edward Longshanks is the most ruthless king ever to sit on the throne of England.
Well, I suppose William the Conqueror, Henry I, John Lackland, etc. just never existed in that case, but oh well. So now later we progress to a scene in the movie when it's a wedding feast for a couple, which we kind of see later on, but not really. And we get introduced to William's best friend, Hamish, and his father. And they become very, very vital people throughout the story. I mean, they help William at Falkirk, at Stirling, and they even fight in his stead at Bannockburn. They would have been a legendary duo if only they were real. But of course, I forgot this is a Mel Gibson film, and all the characters are either made up or are completely wrong. And if Mel Gibson actually did his research before making this film, he would have found out that one of William's closest friends was a man called Curly, not Hamish. However, later when we meet the crazy Stephen of Ireland, there are genuine accounts which do state that he had another close friend called Stephen of Ireland. But of course, Curly and Stephen may not have existed at all. It's just they have some historical backing, whereas Hamish and his father do. do not. So as the movie progresses, not much exactly happens. William falls in love with a commoner called Murron, and he has to get married in secret to avoid, of course, Prima nocta. But eventually, one of the English soldiers tries to rape Murron, and William comes and batters him, so of course she gets away, except no, she doesn't. The English capture her, and they slit her throat to try and get to William to capture him. He then proceeds to clean the knife with no blood in it whatsoever. And then there's that famous scene of William absolutely destroying the English garrison at Lanark, where he absolutely not only breaks legs, but he breaks the laws of physics by cutting through entire chainmail and armour with just one swing. And Hamish's dad, just being shot in one of the lungs, picks up a spear and just throws it right through the chest of one of the Englishmen far away. But of course, nothing will get in Mel Gibson's way, not even physics, if it means that it will show the Scottish are superior. So after William has destroyed the English garrison and kills all of the soldiers there, he slits the throat of the man who slit his lover's throat as well. So he's finally got his revenge, and now he's beginning to take up arms against the English. And that would have been an awesome motivation for his war on England. If only everything I just told you in this last minute or so was actually true. Because the funny thing is, Murron didn't exist. She was complete mythology. She was invented by an aristocratic family known as the Baileys of Leamington. They paid someone to put Murron into the story of William so they could claim to be her descendants, as this was quite a common practice at that time. And she wasn't even called Murron. The Baileys paid for a lady called Marion Braveheart, not Murron. So this raises an obvious question. If Murron didn't exist, why did William ransack the village? And the answer to that question is actually still speculated to this day. William did actually wreak havoc on Sheriff William Heselrigg and his English guards, and by wreak havoc, I mean, he put all the English guards in 2 separate huts and burned them all alive, and he cut the sheriff into pieces with his sword, not just slit his throat. But there are many theories for the motivation of these killings. Some theories for the attack is that William was actually under the orders of a man called Richard of Lundy to organise the assault, and another reason was a land dispute after the English confiscated the Wallace family land, which would essentially make them outlaws, thus having nothing to lose if he were to take it out on the English. So this is supposed to be the watershed moment of William's life. This is the part when he decides to take up arms against the English and join in on the war. Except, no, Wallace was opposed to English rule from the very beginning, as he was actually a well-respected lord just like his father, and he opposed to the ragman role. And he's not some lovely, compassionate, heavenly avenging man who just stood for the freedom and liberation of his people. No, in 1296, there's a record of him and an English soldier stealing a keg of beer from some lady's house. But of course, why would Mel Gibson include that into the story if all it would do is just stain Scotland's hero's honour? Like, no. Of course not. William Wallace was a very honourable, loving Christian man, or so we think. Alright, so now we're approaching the beginning of the Battle of Stirling Bridge, and this battle is possibly one of the most memorable in film history, as you can see that all of the Scots are undetermined and unwilling to fight against the 3 times bigger army that faces them on the other side of the field. So many of them begin to head back home and retreat against the English. Of course, William Wallace needs to ride up and say his famous freedom speech. And then the Scots, of course, win the battle, not fueled by tactics or strategy. No, of course, it was fueled by freedom. Freedom was what drove them to beat the cruel Englishmen. And as history buff says,
so despite having no armour, being outnumbered and being poorly ill-equipped, it's through the power of freedom that the Scots win the day. Ah, so if only Native Americans believed in freedom, then maybe they would have won. I guess they didn't believe in freedom hard enough. I mean, look at this. There is no tact whatsoever with this battle. The Scots and the English assemble on an open field and they simply smash into each other, and eventually, somehow, the Scots win.
I honestly couldn't have put it better myself. No, the reason the Scots won this battle was through sheer tact and strategy. They used their brains to completely wipe out the English. The Scottish chose the location of the battle very, very cunningly, as they knew that the English needed to cross Stirling Bridge in order to reach them. So on the 11th of September 1297, 10,000 Englishmen crossed the bridge 2 by 2, unknowingly into the forest with 6,000 Scots hidden in the trees. And when a third of the English army had crossed, the Scots came out and absolutely annihilated them. Knights in heavy armour on horses could not move in the slippy mud, and the Scots pulled them off their horses and hacked them to death. The English tried to flee, but they all drowned due to their heavy armour, and the remaining English on the other side of the bridge panicked and ran away. It was an amazing victory for the Scottish and a massive, massive pivotal point in the war, as it made the Scottish realise that they actually stood a chance against the English, and they were not these unstoppable monsters that they always thought they were. But of course none of this actually came into the movie, and the Scots charged the fields and won due to sheer courage and determination for their freedom. If only that were true. One thing I find funny about this entire battle is that the Scots are wearing limited to virtually no armour whatsoever, and their weapons are so awful. I mean, what even is this? It just looks like a tool you use at a barbecue, not a weapon to fight a war with. And of course William Wallace is using that blue face paint he used to use to scare the English to intimidate them. Except no, that's not what he wore. That was a copy of the Pictish tribes which fought off the Romans a millennia before this movie was even set. And the Scottish weren't just fighting with sticks and rags against the well-trained and well-armoured English. No, they wore basically the same armour and used almost the same weapons as the English. It was a very, very equal battle. But of course the Scottish used their brains, leading them to have the victory at the end of the day. So basically every single bit in this entire scene of the Battle of Stirling Bridge is completely wrong. It's called the Battle of Stirling Bridge, yet they don't even have a bridge in the movie. They don't even get the armour right, they don't get William's face right, they don't get their weapons right, they don't get anything right whatsoever. But of course if they showed what actually happened in history, then they would see that the Scottish weren't as courageous and awesome as they are in the movie. No, they just use their brains. Isn't that good enough, Mel Gibson? And of course there's that famous scene where William and all his men lift up their kilts and mock the English with their dingles. It's just a shame that the kilt wasn't actually invented until 1725 by an English Quaker. And when was this scene set again? Wait, let me look. 11th September 1297, that was it. Only just over 400 years off, nothing big. But anyways, the Scottish won a very, very memorable victory at Stirling Bridge, and after that we see William being knighted and being named the Guardian of Scotland, which is fairly close enough. He was actually named Joint Guardian of Scotland, along with a man called Andrew de Moray, who later died from his wounds that he gained from the Battle of Stirling Bridge while William was fighting in northern England. And then William was named the Guardian of Scotland, but until then he was just the dual Guardian. And then there was the memorable sacking of York, which showed England that William Wallace was not just some commoner who they could walk all over. If he could take the strongest city in northern England, means he could invade all the way to London and conquer England. Except that's what the English would have thought if William actually reached anywhere near York. No, instead he just raided and pillaged a few villages on the border with Scotland. He never went anywhere near York whatsoever. I have absolutely no idea what the movie is trying to show here. He literally just plundered some very small villages, never a city, especially never with the likes of York. So now we get onto the second battle of this movie, which was the Battle of Falkirk. Now, I could say quite a lot for this battle, as not everything is correct. Firstly, at the very beginning of the battle, the Irish decide that they're on the Scottish side, and then they just turn on the English and betray them. But in reality, the Irish alliance didn't even happen with England. Secondly, there was a lead up to the battle where King Edward tries to bribe William off, buying himself the time to conscript Welsh bowmen, troops from England's land in France, etc, etc. And if you remember my description of Edward earlier, you may have guessed that Edward never would have stooped so low as to try and bribe his enemies off. And then of course there was that big betrayal by Lachlan and Morna. Now sources on this are actually very skeptical, but from what I gathered, it was not Lachlan and Morna. It was a man called John Comyn, who, if you may have seen The Outlaw King, you'd know who he is. Some people theorise that he never actually betrayed William. He actually just got afraid and thought that the battle was lost, so he ran away with his men, causing the Scottish to lose the battle. Now, no one actually knows if this has merit to it or not, but some people believe it was a betrayal, and some people believe it was outright cowardice, so I guess it's up to you. So after the Battle of Falkirk, it's William running away from the English pursuing him, and of course he finds out that Robert the Bruce has betrayed him. Now, in some aspect, this is actually technically true, as Robert the Bruce did switch sides many times throughout the war, although he never directly betrayed William like in this scene. But the movie deliberately tries to play it as some massive betrayal which deeply affected William, as you can clearly see the sadness and despair in his eyes. Why Mel Gibson thought this would be a good idea to put into the film, I have no idea, but it didn't happen. And Robert the Bruce eventually remained loyal to Scotland and fought off the English. So in reality, this battle wasn't as pivotal as Stirling Bridge in my opinion. So a couple scenes later, we see William Wallace hunting down the two nobles who betrayed him on the battlefield, but they didn't actually exist in real life, as it was John Comyn who betrayed him at Falkirk, not Lachlan and Mornay. So this entire scene of William seeking retribution and avenging those he lost at Falkirk is actually complete baloney. This time in the movie, he was actually going to France to plead for French aid, which proved fruitless in the end, as the French said no. But I suppose it adds quite a cool touch on William Wallace, as it's him who seeks revenge and kills all those who betray him. So anyways, when we fast forward a little bit, we see William Wallace completely humiliate the English crown in the worst way possible by pegging the Princess of England. Only, it would have been a really big humiliation if she wasn't 9 years old and still living in France the entire time the war was going on. So, unless William Wallace was a French nonce, I can't really see this happening. So now we reach the climax of the film, where William Wallace is finally captured by the English in Edinburgh, after the noble Craig and Robert the Bruce's leper father betray him. But in reality, Wallace was captured by the English at Rob Royston, which is near Glasgow, after being betrayed by a man called John Menteith, who was a Scotsman. However, his castle was occupied by the English, therefore his loyalty was towards them. So if you look at it one way, it's a betrayal, but if you look at it another way, it's just a man following orders. The noble Craig never actually existed, and the Bruce's father died in 1304, a year before Wallace's capture, so the whole scene, of course, didn't happen that way. Although yes, William was betrayed / given up by his own countrymen. It shows William being beaten by the English for his crimes against them, which was probably what actually happened, and worse, as they even downplay his murder later. And whilst William is under captivity by the English, we see Princess Isabella pleading for William Wallace to have mercy bestowed upon him. But when King Edward denies it, she whispers in his ear,
"Hold your horses there, cowboy."
This is just a quick little interjection by Future Max. Whilst editing this video, I could not find this scene wherever I searched. No matter what I looked up, I couldn't find this scene where Isabella's whispering in King Edward's ear. No matter what I looked up, I couldn't seem to find it anywhere. So basically, in summary, she says, "I have a child in my belly who's not of your line." And yeah, just carry on with the video. Now that's a really interesting statement, considering Prince Edward then went on to have 5 different children with Princess Isabella, so I'm not sure where that statement came from, but according to Mel Gibson it happened. And also, fun fact, while he was possibly one of the worst kings we ever had, Edward II was buried on my birthday, December 20th, 1327. But anyways, now that I'm getting off topic, we need to focus back on William's death. Now this is one scene which was actually under-exaggerated. He was actually drawn behind a horse for 5 miles or so, and then he was hung until the last few seconds when he was going to die. And then when he was let go, before he could even catch his breath, he was stretched for everyone to see, and then disemboweled, castrated. His heart, lungs, and organs were all torn out right in front of him, while they were trying to keep him alive as well. So he was alive watching all of this happening, but then he was finally beheaded and quartered. This, as you know, was called being hung, drawn and quartered, which was a particularly English ritual, which was to ensure that the guilty could not rise again on Judgment Day, and vengeance could not be gained even beyond the grave. His head then sat on London Bridge, and his arms and legs were sent to Berwick, Newcastle upon Tyne, Stirling and Perth as a warning to the Scots to never rise up again, which they eventually did 9 years later, and this time under Robert the Bruce. Now I just want to quickly say that this little bit where William screams, if you've been paying attention throughout this video, you already know what I'm gonna say. The English executioners wouldn't have just stopped the ceremony to get someone to say mercy, because they would have, been a bit busy disemboweling the prisoner. And as he's yelling freedom, we see King Edward I dying, knowing his final wish to see William dead could not be fulfilled. It's just a funny thing that, because last time I checked, Edward I died in 1307, not 1305, and he died of dysentery while travelling up north to deal with some troublesome Scots. So this whole freedom thing is just a bunch of rubbish. So with William dead, we see all the Scottish soldiers lining up on the fields of Bannockburn, ready to surrender to the English. And of course, the narrator just decides to get this right.
After the beheading, William Wallace's body was torn to pieces. His head was set on London Bridge, his arms and legs sent to the 4 corners of Britain as a warning.
So the one thing he gets right about England pretty much in the entire movie is when it's saying something horrible that they did. But all the other things that we did, no, let's just not mention it, or let's just get it entirely wrong, or let's just outright lie about it, why not? But alas, the film ends with one of the best endings, in my opinion, in any film, with the Scottish charging the fields of Bannockburn. They fought like warrior poets. They fought like Scotsmen. And won their freedom. Which would have been an awesome way to end the video if they didn't get the very last piece of dialogue wrong. Yes, the Scottish were starving and vastly outnumbered in reality, and some sources even say that they knelt down and cried out to God for mercy, and they said, "No hand but God's can save us from so great a host." However, Robert knew that sheer force and courage would not win them the day, and that tact, strategy, and a little bit of luck would. So he picked the battleground of the fight exceedingly craftily, and in front there lay marshes through which the English would have to ride in order to reach the Scots who were drawn up upon the dry plain beyond. Where the ground was firm, Robert had his men dig about 3 feet deep, and these pits were filled with twigs and branches of gorse, and the turf was then laid over them again, so that from a distance it looked like a firmer level plain. And on one side of King Robert's position rose the steep castle hill, and on the other flowed the little stream called the Bannock. Only from the front could the English attack, and the front was guarded by pits and marshes, so when the fight began the Scottish cavalry scattered the English archers, and the English horses fell into the pits which the Bruce had caused to be dug. The English army was already in confusion when suddenly, over the brow of a neighbouring hill, there appeared to what seemed to them another Scottish army. So the English fled, blind with fear they rode, hardly knowing where, and many were drowned whilst trying to cross the river Forth, and others fell over the rocky banks of the Bannock till the stream was reportedly choked with the dead. The new army which had so frightened the English was no army at all, but only the servants and the camp followers whom Robert had separated from the soldiers and sent to wait behind the hill. But they had grown tired of watching and doing nothing, so they tied cloths onto poles for banners, and armed themselves with sticks and came to join the fight. And they came just at the right time, for the English, already beginning to feel that the battle was lost, fled before this new host. So, that concludes my review for Braveheart today. I possibly missed out some points which I initially wanted to say, or some points I just got wrong altogether. And for that I apologise. I'm just reading what I wrote down from the research I did. If I got it wrong, then I'm to blame, and I'm sorry for that. But overall, I would give this film a strong 9 out of 10. It was really action-packed and really gripping film in my opinion, and I can definitely see why it deserved 5 Oscar awards. It was a shame that it wasn't the most historically accurate film, but as an epic as a whole, I really enjoyed the film. But yeah, that wraps up everything I was going to say. I really hope you guys enjoyed this video. I know it's very different to the stuff that I usually do on this channel, but I just wanted to experiment and try some other things, which I've wanted to do for a while now, so I thought why not. The next video I'm planning to do on this channel is actually going to be a little bit different to this video, but still historical. I was planning on doing a Game of Thrones video. I will imagine that it's going to get a bit more attention than this video will, as a lot of people enjoy the show. But I'm going to be discussing some Game of Thrones characters and events and their English historical equivalents, such as the Red Wedding, the Battle of Blackwater, etc, etc. It's going to be quite an interesting video, I think, and I'm going to really enjoy making it. But anyways, I can't promise when that video will next be out, but I hope it's going to be soon. So yeah, please leave a like on this video as it genuinely helps out a lot, and please subscribe as well if you haven't already, as it's a massive motivation to keep going with these videos. I'll probably end up going back to my usual sort of videos, but these are just some videos which I've wanted to create for a while now. But yeah, as I said earlier, I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. Please comment down below your thoughts of the video, and if I got anything wrong, please do let me know, as I would genuinely like to correct myself in the future. And yeah, once again, thank you very much guys for watching, and peace.